The largest coal reserves on the planet are the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. China is undergoing a very major industrial development. And the burning of coal is certainly something that must be very attractive for the Chinese looking into the future. I would say that there is no way to solve this problem, even if the United States and the Soviet Union were to come to a perfectly good accord on this issue without involving China and many other nations that will be developing rapidly in the time period we're talking about. So here is a sense in which the nations, to deal with this problem, have to make a change from their traditional concern about themselves and not about the planet and the species, a change from the traditional short-term objectives to longer-term objectives. And we have to bear in mind that in problems like this, the initial stages of global temperature increase, one region of the planet might benefit while another region of the planet suffers. And there has to be a kind of trading off of benefits and suffering. And that requires a degree of international amity which certainly doesn't exist today. I think that what is essential for this problem is a global consciousness, a view that transcends our exclusive identifications with the generational and political groupings into which by accident we have been born. The solution to these problems requires a perspective that embraces the planet and the future, because we are all in this greenhouse together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Coalition forces drive deep into Iraq. Some are reportedly now well advanced on the way to Baghdad. Coalition troops secure vital oil installations, but 30 others are reported on fire. First US and UK casualties in this war. 12 troops have been killed in a helicopter crash and 1 US Marine killed in combat.
Yoram spent a semester in Beijing studying climate change. We discussed his trip and the state of pollution in China, something we had pondered after a reporting trip to the country a few years ago.
We thought a place like the United States isn't going to make that much difference in terms of global warming, climate change going forward, because we're so small a part of the problem compared to China.
There's a lot of truth to that perspective. So, China passed the U.S. as the largest CO2 emitter in the world in 2007, and their emissions still continue to grow rapidly. What happens in China and in India and elsewhere in the developing world is going to drive the climate story in the decades ahead. I do think, however, that what happens here could affect China, especially in terms of technological development. So the happy story that I have about climate change is if we could somehow globally figure out how to produce electricity, especially if we can figure out how to produce electricity without lots of carbon emissions, then we can go a long way towards solving the global warming problem.
I was recently at a technology futurism conference, and they were talking about all the free photons that are pouring down on us daily, and that we are beginning to harness them, and we're doing so at a fast enough rate that they'll take care of the whole problem in, 14, 15 years.
If solar power keeps coming down and down and down, and it doesn't stop, right? If it just heads towards zero, then sure, I guess eventually then they'll come down below the cost of coal. But what economists like to argue for is that we should drive up the price of fossil fuels to incorporate the external costs associated with climate change and air pollution. And one of the reasons for arguing for that is that by driving up the price of fossil fuels, we will drive innovation. That's the best way to drive down the cost of these alternatives.
Welcome from me, Nick Gowing, to Davos in Switzerland at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Among these mountains a year ago, the mood was overflowing wealth, cash and optimism, with better to come. A year later, the world's most important business and political leaders arrived here with crashing markets and fears of a US-led recession and losses of up to $500 billion, a massive figure. It's really hard for any of us to grasp. Then came the Bernanke bombshell from the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, an almost unprecedented 0.75% cut in US interest rates. So we ask, what global financial shocks face us all? Could it become a perfect storm of economic collapse?
This is going to be one of the watershed days in financial markets history.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
I don't think anyone really expected a bank as big as Lehman to, be in a position that it's in now.
Meanwhile, Merrill Lynch, fearing it could be next, agreed in an act of desperation to a shotgun marriage with Bank of America.
It is definitely a very, very difficult time, and it's not going to get better quickly.
So in just 6 months, 3 of the 5 biggest independent firms on Wall Street have now disappeared. Bear Stearns, which collapsed last spring, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch.
The American people can remain confident in the soundness and the resilience of our financial system.
At one level, it's a question of how bad is it?
Man is not going to change, and the sea going to be dead.
There will be a point in the future where we will run out.
What is the tuna that you serve, and how is it caught?
The difference between this and other problems is that actually it is relatively simple to solve.
People say, where are all the fish gone? Where are they? We have eaten them.
The reason I'm delighted to come here is hopefully for your next generation to understand that the normative ways that power has been exerted up until very recently in the assumptions, in my view, are no longer relevant and appropriate and are actually pretty negative and counterproductive. This is what the frustration is among the mid-career, I'd say the late 20s, early 30s, early 40s, who see the inevitability of what's happening. But what I think you need to do is bring together those students of the future, particularly with those who've been through this crisis, the level of crisis at the top, and possibly, nay probably, have either lost their reputation or their job or their career or their organization, their government or their corporate has taken a big hit in the public space because they failed to understand it. And there's an enormous level of casualty in this new space if you're not prepared to understand the inevitability of this.
Coral is a fundamental part of a huge ecosystem.
They continue living as long as their environment allows them to.
There's this big heat wave that's traveling around all over the world. The coral bleaches, and what you're seeing is its skeleton underneath. It's like your body temperature changing. That's the seriousness of the issue.
You're working in an environment every single day that humans were built for. Your body is cut up, and then you open your eyes, and it's dead as far as you can see.
We don't have any time to waste if we want to have any hope.
We live at a unique moment in time where we can change history. It's not too late for coral reefs.
This has got to wake up the world.
Hello and welcome to BBC News. The world's financial markets have reacted with unease following last night's emergency takeover of the troubled Swiss bank Credit Suisse. Shares in Credit Suisse fell by more than 60% this morning after European markets opened, and the value of banking shares across Europe has dropped sharply.
Let me give you a question which I think brings together a lot of what you've been talking about how you incentivize. This comes from Katie Batten, who's Director of Interconnected. Do you think that regulations and targets will be the key driver for the necessary change in the necessary period of time? Or is it possible that a greater moral human motivation from leaders to take their organizations beyond the targets is on its way, knowing the rewards will come, even if there's a political price?
Katie, it's a fantastic question. So, I'm not dodging it by saying both. But in the following respect, which is first, what we've been talking about is a series of examples of regulations, forward-dated regulations that then pull forward action today, change the economics, get investment at scale. But one of the questions that companies have to ask themselves, and financial institutions that lend or invest in those companies have to ask themselves is, well, what's necessary? What is the regulation or the consumer behavior that's necessary ultimately for us to get to net zero? And if I think there's the commitment to be there, well, then how do I adjust today before the regulation comes into place? And that's why we put a lot of emphasis on net zero plans. That's why we put a lot of emphasis on forward-looking, on scenario analysis and the pathways. And the question for every board and every senior management team is, well, what does your strategy look like? What does your business look like if we collectively, for moral and intergenerational fairness and other reasons, if we do what we need to do in order to get to 1.5 degrees? That's a basic question for every company.
We've learned, over the past 30, 40 years that planet Earth is a complex, self-regulating system where you have, the atmosphere, the ice sheets, the oceans, and the living biosphere all interacting together. And these interactions is what determines the state of the planet. And the planet has been in one very desirable state since we left the last ice age. The reason why the planet stays in this desired state is that the large biophysical systems on Earth, like the ice sheets, like the large rainforests, like the big overturning of heat that regulate the El Nino system and the big weather systems in the world, these big tipping element systems, they not only regulate the state of the planet, they have multiple states. They can be in a good state supporting us, but if they're pushed too far, they cross a tipping point and they fall over and start behaving against us instead of helping the planet to stay in a desired state. And that is what we call a tipping point. What determines a tipping point is that the feedbacks that hold the systems in the desired state, which for us means that they cool and dampen when we stress, for example, by burning fossil fuels, remains in that desired state. So, for example, a rainforest, which absorbs carbon, remains in that state thanks to the fact that it self-generates its own rainfall. It's a kind of a self-regulating system which cools the planet by absorbing carbon. If you cut down too many trees, you warm it too much, it starts burning up, it starts drying out, it crosses a tipping point, and it stops this feedback of generating rainfall. It becomes a self-drying system. The feedback changes direction.
And we begin this hour with breaking news out of Geneva, a dire message from climate scientists. They warn unprecedented and even irreversible changes are happening to this planet and say it is beyond any doubt that human activity is to blame. Live from London, Dominic, what more can you tell us about the big warnings of this report?
Yeah, good morning, Asha. Well, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has this morning described today's report from the IPCC as a code red for humanity. It is grim reading. Its authors say climate change is now widespread, rapid and intensifying, that human activity has warmed the climate at a rate unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years.
We'll also talk about the Swiss government being taken to court by climate activists who say its policies are violating their right to life and health. We'll also talk about AI. Some of the biggest names in technology are calling for the development of advanced artificial intelligence to be put on hold. The signatories include Elon Musk and Apple's co-founder Steve Wozniak. They're warning AI could pose a threat to humanity.
Young people around the world are looking at what we're doing. They look at the World Bank and they say, oh, you've got a climate denier in charge of the World Bank. So why are you surprised that the World Bank is completely failing? People in authority are not doing their job. There's a lot of blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of words and there are some meaningful commitments, but we are still failing badly. We cannot let the oil companies and gas companies and petrostates tell us what is permissible. In the last COP, we were not allowed to even discuss scaling down oil and gas.
Today, Azerbaijan's share in global oil production is 0.7. To accuse us that we have oil is the same like to accuse us that we have more than 250 sunny days a year in Baku. It's a gift of the God, every natural resource. And countries should not be blamed for having them and should not be blamed for bringing these resources to the market, because the market needs them. The people need them.
Let's head to Spain now, where the authorities have opened a temporary morgue in a convention centre as the death toll from the flooding rises above 200, making this Europe's worst weather disaster in 5 decades. The Valencia region was hit by an entire year's worth of rainfall in just a few hours. It triggered flash floods and swollen rivers. Many roads, bridges and rail tracks have also been destroyed, while power and internet continues to be disrupted.
This new study that shows that the world's biggest rainforest, the Amazon, has lost an area the size of Germany and France combined to deforestation in 4 decades. I think it almost needs repeating, doesn't it? The Amazon has lost an area the size of Germany and France combined in 4 decades. Just take us through what's happening to one of the world's most precious resources.
It's the first time that it's been catalogued in such a reliable method. So that's 1/5 of the entire Amazon, which is now gone. Unfortunately, the more and more hectares are at threat. So it's thought to be about 38% of the forests as well. On top of that, are actually in a degraded state.
And Michael, this is the fault of humankind?
Yeah, so sadly it's mostly deforestation, but then it's also entwined and linked with aspects of climate change, which again are anthropogenically driven, and that's causing the forests to dry out a lot more. So they're witnessing less rain, and so the Amazon, on top of losing the trees and obviously the biodiversity which goes with that, the rivers are starting to dry out as well.
Dear future generations, I think I speak for the rest of us when I say, sorry. Sorry we left you with our mess of a planet. Sorry that we were too caught up in our own doings to do something. Sorry we listened to people who made excuses to do nothing. I hope you forgive us. We just didn't realize how special the earth was. Like a marriage gone wrong. We didn't know what we had until it was gone. For example, I'm guessing you probably know it as the Amazon desert, right? Well, believe it or not, it was once called the Amazon rainforest, and there were billions of trees there, all of them gorgeous. And oh, you don't know much about trees, do you? Well, let me tell you, trees are amazing. I mean, we literally breathe the air they are creating. They clean up our pollution, our carbon. They store and purify water, give us medicine that cures our diseases, food that feeds us, which is why I'm so sorry to tell you that we burn them down. Cut them down with brutal machines, horrific, at a rate of 40 football fields every minute. That's 50% of all the trees in the world gone in the last 100 years. Why? For this. And that wouldn't make me so sad if it weren't so many pictures of leaves on it.
Hello, I'm Nick Gowing. Today is January the 1st, 2050. I regret enormously that I have to report that humanity failed on its UN targets for climate, nature, and people. Planet Earth is now uninhabitable for human life. The economic system has been in a state of collapse for the last 30 years, a scenario many a leader presumed was unthinkable. But today, it's over.